Today I'm joined by AC Grayling. AC Grayling is the Master of the New College of the Humanities in London, and he's the Professor of Philosophy there. He's the author of over 30 books on philosophy, biography, the history of ideas, and essays. Today we're discussing his latest book, The Good State, on the Principles of Democracy. Now, Professor Grayling, when you use the words democratic or democracy, what do you mean exactly?
Well, of course, the word itself is a very capacious one, isn't it? And all sorts of things are meant by it, including things that are very undemocratic, as we see from the Democratic Republic of North Korea and the like. So, I mean, as we all know, in its literal acceptation, in its etymology, it means a government or ruled by the people, by the demos. But it has never, of course, literally meant that, because it's always in fact meant ruled by the enfranchised portion of the population. And until pretty recently, the enfranchised portions of populations have been pretty small. I mean, both in the United Kingdom and the United States, often cited as sort of great examples of Western democracies. The franchise was restricted to men, and for a very long time to men only of property or of property and education. So, you know, it's less than a century before the idea of an inclusive franchise for all adult members of the population has become a reality. But that's what it's meant to mean. It's meant to be ruled by the people.
And the book can't be divorced from the context in which it's written. So how did the Brexit years between 2016 and 2019 and the Trump presidency shape the book?
Well, in the following way, that I mean, I'm very, be quite frank and open about this. I'm a very, very passionate pro-European. I mean, I think there are lots of things that are wrong with the EU, there's no question. It needs reform. It's a work in progress. But the sort of fundamental concept of it, the idea of a great cooperative project of peace and advance and progression, and the commitments that the EU polities have jointly made to human rights and civil liberties and so on, seems to me to be magnificent, especially when you contrast them with what are, in essence, 19th century versions of what it is to be a great political entity. Those 19th century versions, the sort of imperialistic ones, are ones that are still fundamentally informing the attitude of the United States of America and China, the two other great hegemons in our world today. Whereas the EU, tries to do things with soft power, sees the great truth that lies deep in the insight. An insight, by the way, that you find in Tom Paine, you find it in Cobden and Bright and, the free traders of the 19th century, that when countries are very, very intimately, mutually connected to one another through trading relations and through their intercourse between their populations, it's very hard for them to go to war. And I often say to people, look, just go on YouTube and have a look at a couple of minutes footage of Europe in 1945. And what you see there in the devastation and in the queues of hundreds of thousands of refugees and so on, you're seeing the history of Europe, which has been a very bloody, internecine, really protracted civil war for centuries and centuries and centuries among the people of Europe. And the European Union is a great project for peace and progress, despite all its flaws. So I'm a very sort of passionate espouser of it, campaigned, obviously, therefore, for Remain, and was devastated by the outcome. Not merely the fact that on the day of the referendum, the 23rd of June 2016, a day of infamy in my book, 51.89% of votes cast were for leave. But the penumbra of problems that surrounded that vote represented 37% of the total electorate. By any stretch of the imagination, nowhere near enough for a massive constitutional and historic change of the kind that leaving the EU would involve. That was one problem. The other problem was that given the doctrine of the sovereignty of Parliament, no referendum result could be binding on Parliament unless Parliament itself had legislated for that to be the case, as it had done in 2011 on the proportional representation referendum. But a political commitment had been made by David Cameron, who said that he would abide by the outcome of the referendum. So what was that outcome? Was the 51.89% enough? Was the 37% the right number to be looking at for this? Do you know what? The outcome of that referendum has never been debated in the Parliament of the United Kingdom. It's never actually been addressed, that question. But immediately everybody jumped to the conclusion, we're out, we voted, we, the people, the country as a whole has voted to leave. And everything since then has been a whole unfolding series of sort of disastrous realizations, not just about the terribly deleterious impact on our economy. And by the way, you know, that means individual people losing their jobs, families without an income earner, communities where local shops close down because, you know, they just the amount of money around is insufficient to keep them going and so on. It's devastating. It's just awful when you think about that kind of impact. And by the way, we'll come to this point maybe, it seems to me to be a primary responsibility of government to act in the interests of all of the country as a whole, so that any policy that involved loss of jobs, of incomes, of possibilities and potential for a people would have to be, you know, there would have to be an extremely good reason for it, like, for example, a war, a justified war. Anyway, so one could go on for ages and ages about all the misinformation and the misuse of social media, the fact that messaging was targeted at selected groups, that other people couldn't see the messages and therefore couldn't call them out if they contained misinformation, as so many of them did. I mean, the whole thing was a debacle. So I wrote a book in the sort of white heat of anger and dismay about this, called Democracy and Its Crisis, in which I talked about what a representative democracy is really meant to be, how it's meant to work. Fundamental idea there, very simply put, is that there is a dilemma at the basis of democracy, which is, on the one hand, you want political power to reside in the hands of the people, however you define the people, and as extensively as possible, obviously. So you want them to have final say. They are the source of authority and legitimacy in the state. But if you were going to have sort of daily referenda by, you know, pressing a button on your TV set or your mobile phone or something, then you would want the demos to be very well informed, to have full, accurate information, to have listened to expert advice, to have discussed and debated, to have listened to arguments, and to make very, very well-informed choices about how they are going to vote. And this is a lot to expect from a population as a whole, most of whom have other things to worry about: their kids, their jobs, their, you know, going to the supermarket and so on. And this is why we elect representatives. Now, in fact, the idea of representative democracy is a rather brilliant idea. It's one that was worked out to try to deal with Plato's problem. You know, Plato said, look, put political power into the hands of the people, and what do you get? Mob rule, because they're going to be insufficiently well informed and too self-interested and too short-termist and too rivalrous and so forth. So between the 17th and 19th centuries, from the discussions in Locke all the way through to John Stuart Mill, you know, we see the development, the emergence of this idea of representative democracy, where we elect people to go to the legislature to get that information, to think, to listen to advice, to debate and discuss and listen to argument, and to act on our, where our means everybody, not just constituents, but the country as a whole, act in our interests. That is the, as it were, the ideal. Of course, what has happened is that the representatives we now elect have turned this into, you know, a source of revenue and glory. I mean, they've made a career of it, and careerism in politics is incredibly corrosive. In fact, quite a lot of what's gone wrong is the result of the party line, of the whipping system, of you know, the whole thing, which we may come back to. So I discussed in that book, Democracy and Its Crisis, which came out, I think, in 2017, what had gone wrong, both in the Brexit referendum and in the Trump election too, because, you know, something in the kind of foundations of contemporary major democracies like those two which are both, by the way, based on the first past the post electoral system, and which have constitutional arrangements which mean, in effect, that too much power is sequestered away from the people by not really representing genuinely the diversity of choices and preferences in the population, and have put it too much in the hands of the executives in both those countries, and especially in ours in the UK. But having written that book, I thought really one needs to dig a lot deeper. So after I'd sort of vented my fury by writing that book, I wanted to dig just a little bit deeper and think a little bit about what's actually entailed by the concept of democracy. If you're going to take very seriously the idea that it's us, it's the people, the folk, the citizens, all of the citizens capable of understanding what's at stake in the issues that face a country. And so this is why I think that the electoral age should be lowered to 16. It should be as inclusive as possible, really, but it must also be proportional. That is to say, it really must reflect that diversity of interest and choice and preference and need. And so the really key thing that comes out of an investigation of what a democracy should be like and what it should seek to do turns upon it being a properly representative democracy. So that is the argument in essence of the book that we're discussing today.
And you've touched on some of the points there, but you take issue with this thing you call the Westminster model. And what do you mean by that, and what's your problems with it?
Okay, so the problem with the Westminster model is that it doesn't separate the executive power from the legislative power. The key fault of the Westminster model is that the government is formed from the majority in the legislative house. Now, again, if you think about it, if we're just being sort of abstract and talking ideals here, we would have a legislature where policy is debated and decisions are taken. And then we have an executive arm which carries out what the legislature has decided. If, however, the executive is drawn from the majority in the legislature, and indeed consists of the leaders of the majority in the legislature, then the legislature becomes the creature of the executive. The executive controls the legislature. And the bigger the majority that the executive controls in the legislature, the more of a rubber stamp the legislature is for the executive. And the executive is, by sort of definition, going to be a small group of people at the top of the system. So it is the failure of separation of powers in the Westminster model, which is so dangerous. We've seen it happen before our very eyes just in the last few years, that either a small powerful clique in the party can control the executive or be the executive, as is now the case, because we now have the Leave campaign actually squatting in Downing Street at the moment, so they really are, got their hands on all the levers of power. But you get a small clique controlling the executive, and the executive controlling the legislature, and therefore controlling everything. And that is the fundamental weakness. And this is important because there are in the region of about 50 countries around the world which have the Westminster model. I mean, the obvious ones are Australia, New Zealand, India, Canada. Canada is closest to the UK. New Zealand is furthest away because they've introduced this form, not actually more that satisfactory, but a form of proportional representation which exerts quite a lot of control over the executive. You see, either you have a genuine separation of powers between legislature and executive, or you have the legislature so constituted by proportional means of representation that no executive can ever really just sort of run away with the power in the country. By the way, that's something else that we've seen just recently in the UK, because in the 2 years between the 2017 and 2019 general elections, we had a hung parliament. And a hung parliament is a beautiful example of what a legislature should be, because it means that every single thing that the executive wants to do stands or falls on its own merits. They have to win the argument every single time. They don't have an automatic majority which just rubber stamps things through, but they've got to win the argument on the floor of the House of Commons every single day. And that is exactly how the relationship between the legislature and the executive should be. So that is the key flaw. In the United States of America, it's slightly different, because there the US Constitution is in fact modeled on what Montesquieu thought was the English Constitution after 1688. A king, that's the president, and then House of Lords, House of Commons, that's the Senate and House of Representatives, and then the judiciary. The idea of the independence of the judiciary came in at the beginning of the 18th century. So they've got a separation between executive and legislature, but where the great failing is of the US system, apart from the first past the post voting for the House of Representatives, is that there is no separation between the uppermost level of the judiciary, the Supreme Court, and the executive, because it's appointed by the executive. And that is something we see as a major problem in the United States, because the constitution of the Supreme Court, let's say the personnel of the Supreme Court, can have a massive impact for decades on what happens in the US. And this is something, change in the nature of the personnel, which is in the gift of a president, of the executive.
And what do you want the UK constitution to look like?
Well, I think at very, very least, the constitution of our country should be clear, and that will probably mean codified, but then there are a lot of qualifications that one wants to add, because there have to be sensible, mature-minded ways of making sure that a codified constitution or codified parts of a constitution remain sufficiently flexible without just being open to any administration to change, but sufficiently flexible to deal with the changes that happen in our world. But codification means clarity and consistency. Now, let me give you an example of the failure of those two things which have been so disastrous for us. The very first referendum held in this country was in 1972. It was a referendum in Northern Ireland about whether or not the people of Northern Ireland wished to join with the rest of Ireland or not. And that was a big departure for our constitutional arrangements here. The last time that a referendum had been mooted was in 1945, and Churchill asked Attlee whether he thought there should be a referendum on whether or not the coalition government should continue until the defeat of Japan later in 1945. And Attlee said, absolutely not. Referendums are the devices of tyrants and dictators, and the example that they were living with the consequences of was the referendum that had, given all that power to the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s. Mrs. Thatcher and various other people were against referendums, so it wasn't just a partisan thing on Attlee's part. But they had a referendum in 1972 because when you get a situation where the legislature and executive feel powerless to make a decision, or too frightened to make a decision, or don't want to because it might connect them too much with one particular kind of political view, and they duck their responsibility. Remember, I said, you've got power in the hands of the people, and then you have a representative government, a representative system, which is meant to try to express everything that the people would want in their best interests. But if you give up this side and put it back into the hands of the people, then you take the risk of falling foul of Plato's strictures on, the ochlocratic potential of the demos. And this is what tends to happen in referendums. But the point I want to make now is that every single referendum that we've had since 1972, so including the devolution referendums, including the EEC referendum of 1975, the proportional representation referendum 2011, and then the EU referendum 2016, they've all been held on a different basis. For example, the 1979 Scottish devolution referendum required that there be a minimum of 40% of the entire electorate should agree to devolution for it to happen. There was a majority of votes cast, I think it was about 53 or 54%, in favor of devolution, but that was only about 34% of the total electorate, so it didn't happen. In the 2011 PR referendum, and by the way, it was a really bad system of PR that was suggested. The Conservatives were dead against it. They undermined it. They put it on the same day as local elections. The turnout was in the low 30% and so on. But that referendum in the legislation put the whole issue of proportional representation to bed for generations. That was the hope of it. But it's an example of how different referendums have had different bases. Unclear as to what exactly a referendum is and what the outcome is and what should be done with it, and inconsistent. So codification of a constitution introduces consistency and clarity, and it's terribly important that the very central parts of our constitution should have clarity and consistency, because the moment they don't. Our constitution has been very well described as a set of understandings that nobody understands. Very useful for whoever happens to be in the controlling seat.
Let's talk about votes for 16-year-olds. Now, why should the cut-off age be 16? David Runciman at Cambridge calls for the voting age to be lowered to 6. Why should it be 16?
Well, there has to be some sort of cutoff point where you can be reasonably sure that people will understand what's at stake, will understand the issues. I'm sure there are people of 14, 12, 10, 8, and perhaps even 6 indeed, who do understand the issues perfectly well, probably a lot better than most of those squatting in Downing Street today. But the sort of logic that lies behind thinking you can do your military service from 16, you can get married from 16, and so on. You leave school, it used to be the case, you can leave school at 16, go into the world. I mean, those sorts of ideas are non-arbitrary. I mean, yes, they're arbitrary to some extent because you've chosen a point, but you've tried to choose a point where you can have a reasonable confidence that you've sort of captured most people in the particular net that you want to capture them in. And in the case of voting, the net you want is, do you understand the issues? You know, have you got a view? So that's why one would put the voting age as high as 16. The reason for putting it as low as 16 is that people in the very last years of their secondary education and perhaps going on into the world of work or going on into tertiary education are entering a world, into a situation which directly affects them. Think about somebody who turns 18 just after the last general election. And just suppose that there's not another general election for 5 years. This means that a person is, pretty well all the way to their mid-20s before they have a chance of a say about how things are in the society that they're becoming a participant in. They're paying taxes, they're working, they have responsibilities and liabilities, but they've yet had no opportunity to have a say. But I do think, however, that if you were to lower the voting age to 16, 2 things are essential. One we've already mentioned, which is a form of proportional representation. And by the way, let's get back to that because, that's a controversial enough point in its own right. And the second is that there should be a much greater effort in our education system to make people understand what having a vote means and why it's so important. I mean, after all, the people who died to get the vote, the blood that has been shed, the awful situation of people who have no say whatever and no opportunity to engage in shaping how their country is going to be and how it's going to impact their own lives. That's something that people should really, really understand. I wrote a book about this a number of years ago called Towards the Light, which is about the growth of the concept of liberty in all its different spheres, liberty of thought, political liberty, social liberty, and so on. Because I felt then, and that was at the time when the then government, which was happened to be a Labour government at the time, was thinking of introducing biometric data identity cards and pooling information about individuals and so on. And I've always thought that inefficiency in a social system is a great protector of civil liberties. So I was very much against the idea of a biometric identity card. I'm afraid that ship has now sailed. You know, we're all giving up our privacy and information all the time. Every time we open our phones. So that ship is there. But anyway, it is a very, very important point. And therefore, at schools, there should be moots and debates and elections and what have you, you know, and then it should be a big deal when you become 16 and you've got the vote. I say there should be a kind of political version of a bar mitzvah. You know, you've really come of age and you've now got this incredibly important, precious thing. Conjoin that with proportional representation, a more alert, a better informed, a more engaged population. I mean, again, you know, if you can't vote until you're 23 because you turned 18 at the wrong time, you kind of get marginalized a bit by what's happening in politics and not recognizing that to be involved, to be aware and informed, and to have a vote means that you could make a difference. And that's terribly important in a democracy.
When do you think British democracy was at its height? When was it strongest?
Well, I really honestly don't think that as a system it has ever been anything to write home about. I mean, I think it has always been profoundly flawed. But here is a thing. I say in the book, I report in the book, a remark made by Leslie Stephen, Virginia Woolf's father, in an article he wrote in the early 1880s. He said, "We have a doctrine, the doctrine of the sovereignty of Parliament, which entails that if Parliament decided that all blue-eyed babies should be murdered, should be killed, then that would be the law and we would all have to obey." That's how sovereign Parliament is. That's how much power it wields. But, he said, we would never dream of doing such a thing because we're all gentlemen. Okay. Well, for one thing, he wrote that article 50 years before the Nazis came into power in Germany and precisely started to kill, you know, a version of blue-eyed babies in large numbers. So he was just wrong that could never happen. And secondly, there is no guarantee that the people who populate the House of Commons are always going to be gentlemen. In fact, on the recent evidence, rather few of them seem to be such. Now, he was picking up on a point that John Stuart Mill had made in his book on representative government, because Mill said, again, in connection with the idea of the sovereignty of Parliament, he said, the thing that restrains Parliament from using these total absolute powers that it has is what he called constitutional morality, a sense of restraint, a sense of doing the decent thing among people who go into Parliament. And of course, he was in the sort of long shadow of a time when MPs weren't paid. They had to have independent resources who went into Parliament, therefore, for different reasons. Not all of them were, by a long chalk, careerists. You know, not very many of them particularly wanted, since they tended on the whole to be people of independent means, to take on the quite demanding job of being a minister or something. So there were a different sort of person who were there for different kinds of reasons. Now, that was a very undemocratic phase in the history of our parliamentary system. And so, it would be quite wrong for anybody to argue we should go back to those days. What we would like to be able to have, though, is people who go into Parliament for the service that they can do, not for the career that it can represent to them. One way of doing that would be to limit the number of times people can be elected. Maybe you can only be elected once, or maybe we can populate Parliament by sortition, by the same lottery means that we populate juries. There are reasons why you might want to do the latter. A reason why you might want to do the former is that if you've got somebody who is really very good value in Parliament, who was really very thoughtful, who read the legislation, which is something that not very many MPs really do, and who voted really sensibly on it, then you would want that kind of person to be around for a bit longer than just one parliamentary term. So, there are pros and cons of these different ideas. But the moment which, as it were by accident, our parliamentary arrangements produced people who were more inclined to be statesmanlike than not, was probably at some point in the 19th century, when people like Mill and Stephen could think that gentlemanly restraint and a sense of honor and decency and so on was being infused into government. In fact, of course, it wasn't, because this was the height of empire and terrible things were happening, and so forth. So it really wasn't. The answer, therefore, is that our parliamentary system has never been up to scratch.
And how does British democracy adapt to the new age of social media?
Well, and this is a really, really good point, because, on the one hand, one doesn't want to see social media come under controls, under censorship and the like, despite the fact that most of what happens on social media is ghastly, just absolutely horrible. All the trolling and the nasty things that people do and say, the viciousness of it, which, by the way, could be moderated somewhat by getting rid of anonymity. You get people who say, well, you shouldn't get rid of anonymity because then people can't blow the whistle or speak out against injustice and so on if they have to let their names be known. But quite frankly, getting rid of anonymity and not letting people have a social media platform unless you know exactly who they are and where they live and so on, that really would make a very, very big difference to the sort of sewage farm which social media really is. But it is also a kind of universal agora. It's also a place where people can communicate and where new ideas can pop up. It's also incredibly powerful. I think, for example, of the advent of a new technology which absolutely transformed the world, printing, back in the 15th century. At the beginning, early in the 16th century, Luther was putting forward arguments, ideas, claims, objections, and so on, which had very often been voiced before by Jan Hus, for example, a couple of centuries before in Bohemia. But he lived when a new technology had really, really very rapidly become available to everybody, and that was printing. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press, millions of books, within half a century, millions of books were appearing, and tracts and pamphlets and so on. And so Luther was saying what people had said before, but he was saying it in tens of thousands of pamphlets that were spreading all over Europe. And that had the effect of changing history, without any question. Well, social media, your mobile phone, the video on your mobile phone, a video of George Floyd being killed by a policeman on an American city street, gone viral, and may very well have this huge impact of changing our world now. Another example of how a technology which didn't exist, a couple of decades ago, has this world-transforming potential. So there are aspects of it which are good in that way. There are many, many aspects of it which are very bad. But so the way to deal with it, apart from things like getting rid of anonymity and so on, is having robust electoral and governmental and legislative institutions in place, where a real opportunity for sensible, mature-minded, I keep using those expressions, but sensible, mature-minded debate and discussion and decision-making can take place. So this is why I think institutions which are properly constituted, properly elected, whose duties are clear and consistent, who can be recalled. I think, for example, that it should be open to people to recall their MPs on more grounds than are currently available for doing so, if they really aren't, up to scratch. Of course, providing that it's not done in an irresponsible and party political kind of way all the time. But if you have robust institutions, then you can meet these challenges that social media present. One final point on that, by the way, political messaging should not be such that they can be micro-targeted. That it should be by law a requirement that if you're going to put out a political message, it's got to be able to be seen by everybody. Because one of the really undermining things that happened in 2016 was this selective targeting. I mean, we all know that there's Republican, Democrat, they've made up their minds, they know how they're going to vote. But it's the people in between, the small swing voters in the swing states, tiny number of people who make a huge difference. I mean, think the Conservative Party got 4% more votes in 2019 than they did in 2017. And the difference was in 2017, a hung parliament. In 2019, an 80-seat majority over all the other parties combined, on a total, by the way, of 29% of the electorate. I mean, really, it's just, our system is just so dysfunctional and so, dramatic in its ill effects that it's kind of a wonder that we aren't all out on the streets with our pitchforks already.
What would you say to critics who think that democracy is an inefficient, ineffective system of government, especially on matters such as climate change, pandemics even?
Right, well, I would agree with them. I mean, I do think it's an incredibly inefficient and ramshackle affair. But one thing I agree with Winston Churchill about is that it's the least bad of most of the systems you can think of. We always think we would like everything to work absolutely perfectly. We'd like to be in utopia, EU-topia. Well, yes, we would like to be in EU-topia, I think, rather than where we are at the moment. But we're never going to get a perfect system. A system is always one where constant adjustment and negotiation and renegotiation is required. We all know the saying that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and it's really, really true. I mean, what's happened in the last few years is an example of us all taking our eye off the ball. Complacency, thinking that our institutions are okay. The Dominic Cummings of this world are people who have noticed that. They've said, you know what, you can hack this system pretty easily, actually. All you would have to do is micro-target, spend all your money on just 500,000 people, 500,000 people, and you could get a massive majority in Parliament, and then you could do what the hell you like because Parliament is sovereign. It is that dysfunctional. It is, if you can do it, you can get it done, and it's been done. I mean, we're witnesses to it at this very moment. Now, either we sink with the Titanic, or we do something about this and we change it, which is the point of writing books about it.
I want to ask about something that was very important to you, and that was the second referendum. Now, do you think its failure was inevitable from the start?
No, I don't at all. And in fact, I give talks to Remainer organizations all around the country, and still do, because there's the huge body of people. I mean, as you know, the majority of the electorate in this country wants to be in the EU. There has never been more than a 37% of the total electorate who have wanted to leave the EU. The highest ever proportion of the electorate was in June 2016, 37%, and it's never been higher than that. The people who voted for Conservatives and UKIP and the Brexit Party back in December 2019 were just over 29% of the total electorate. So we're just really waiting our chance to get back into the EU, and there is a very definite route to do that. If we could persuade all the opposition parties to combine together for the next general election, which will be in another 2 or 3 years' time, on a platform of electoral reform, and we had a reformed parliament after it had been, the electoral system had been changed, almost inevitably, the question would be put back to the people: do we want to rejoin the EU? I mean, it is practically, from a practical point of view, quite possible that we could be back in the EU in 6-7 years' time. I mean, it seems unlikely, it seems improbable, and infuriates some people to think of this, but it could definitely happen. By the way, all the opposition parties other than Labour have already agreed on the joint platform and electoral reform as a part of that platform. Happily, we see the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, making some favourable noises about electoral reform. That is something that we must really work at persuading them to do. In order to have a really effective common platform of the opposition parties, there is one key thing that Labour has got to do, and we are interested to see whether the Labour Party is genuinely a party that wants to serve the interests of everybody in our country, and that is they have to suspend the clause in their constitution which requires that a candidate be fielded in every constituency. They have to do that because there are some constituencies they have no chance of winning, and they will just take votes away from Greens or Lib Dems or Plaid or SNP, and we want the best possible chance to get rid of the Conservatives at the next election. Sorry, that's my own personal political view creeping in there. But if you had that, if you had electoral reform and you had a truly representative, more representative parliament, then the chance of rejoining the EU, given the great groundswell, is there. So in these talks that I give, I always begin by saying this. I say, in November of 2019, November of last year, we were this close to stopping Brexit. If the opposition parties had not agreed to an election, by now we would have had a second referendum and the whole nightmare of leaving the EU would be over. We came this close to doing it. And that was a terrible mistake on the part of the leaders of the then leader of the Labour Party and the then leader of the Liberal Democratic Party to agree to an election. So, you know, I mean, that's that story. It just shows you. And I thought all the way along after, you know, rising from my bed of despair on the 24th of June 2016, that if we organized ourselves, if we put the arguments with clarity and passion, that we would be able to get people to understand that this was a dreadful historic mistake that we were making and that we should amend it. Well, now it's just going to take a bit longer to do it, but we will, because I mean, you know, it seems completely incredible that we will just see ourselves sink and sink and sink into a kind of third world status, which is, you know, a possibility, without thinking, what about the great opportunity that we had and that we could have again of being a leading nation among the nations of Europe, continuing to have a very, very good effect for ourselves and our people, our possibilities and opportunities, but also doing some good work in the world at large.
I appreciate you're really busy, so I'll finish with two. I don't know if you're familiar with the study that came out from Cambridge University this year by Roberto Foa, among others, and they found that dissatisfaction with democracy was at its highest levels in 25 years. Now, how long do you think the democratic process, the democratic method has got left?
Well, again, you know, I think if we were able to make democracy more responsive, more effective, we could very quickly get people to see the value of it and the point of it. Because after all, what are the alternatives? You know, some forms of oligarchy or autocracy or tyranny or dictatorship or something. We're not in a position actually where, as in ancient Rome, we need to appoint a dictator to solve our problems for us. On the contrary, we should be demanding of ourselves that we step up to being more thoughtful and more you know, active, to participate more in the kinds of decisions that shape how we live. So I'm optimistic about it. I'm always optimistic about most things because pessimism isn't really an option. If you were genuinely pessimistic about anything, you would just look for a high building to jump off, wouldn't you? So I'm optimistic about democracy if we can get it, if we can optimize it. Like I say, it's never going to be perfect, but if we solve the problems that it's beset by now, in the United Kingdom, that's the first past the post voting system has got to go. We've got to have a proportional system of representation, and we've got to find ways of clarifying and making more consistent those central constitutional provisions which govern how we elect, how we control the executive branch of government in our country, so that we can make it more of a service and less of a partisan affair driving an agenda of just one part of the community.
And we touched on it earlier on, and you said hopefully we'd talk about it, so let's talk about it. It's concerning social justice. Now, what should be done to overcome the inequalities that have manifested themselves over the last 30, 40 years? Do you want a radical overhaul of our current society, our capitalist system, or do you want gradual pragmatic change?
Well, I certainly want change because I mean, apart from anything else, even the most sort of uncaring person, a person who didn't care about people who are disadvantaged by the incredible injustices in our society, ought to have pointed out to him, and it would probably be a him, that injustice in society is very, very corrosive. And injustice isn't about absolute poverty and so on. It's about the great differences there are in incomes, in opportunities, in educational level, in access to social goods like healthcare and so on, which exist in a society which is so skewed in favor of the better off. So in such a society, you get political problems, you get disaffection, you get the rise of populism. And populism, by the way, isn't about the populace. It's about demagogues coming in and making promises to certain sections of the population, which rouses them up to do things that in the end prove to be destructive. You have to remember there's scarcely any revolution in history, any political revolution in history, which was inherited by the revolutionaries. Revolutions always get captured by people who make things worse afterwards, and so any revolution should be as evolutionary as it possibly can be. But getting rid of the injustices is key, and the way to do it is to firstly make redistribution in society through the systems of taxation, inheritance, and so on a bit more rational. They're not all that rational at the moment. Let's balance that with the fact that it would be very unfair to introduce punitive systems of redistribution, because then it really is true that there will be disincentives and so on. But there can be fairer means of distribution in society. But the really important thing is that society should invest in opportunity. It should invest in people's education, in their health, in their opportunities, support people to really get their hands on the things that would make life a much better and more equal thing for everybody. You're never going to be able to get equality in a society. If you try, then you do it at the very great risk of skewing other things that are desirable among our civil liberties, including, for example, individual liberty and opportunity. But you can make a society a much more equitable one, a much fairer one, by making it a more inclusive one. There have been points in our own history when there was greater fairness and inclusion, when the sort of burdens that we must all bear weren't so unequally, disproportionately shared out. And there's no reason why we can't get back to it. But it doesn't have to be smash everything and remold it closer to our heart's desire, and lose some of the things that we value, like, for example, some of the civil liberties that make our society what it is in its better dimensions. But if we can balance that with creating greater social justice, then that's all to the good. And indeed, I discuss this very point in the book about the fact that promotion of social justice consistently with the preservation of very important civil liberties is in fact a duty of a democratic order. I mean, it's something that follows from the very concept of democracy.
Okay, AC Grayling, thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot, man. Nice to talk to you.